Hello and welcome. This panel is entitled The Reality of Fake News, Russian Strategic Doctrine in the Western Democracy. Thank you for joining us. I would like to start by thanking our sponsors. First of all, the Departments of Anthropology, History, and Political Science, as well as the American Democracy Project. And of course, I want to thank the folks at College TV for recording this and WBOI for making it available to people. Our panelists today should be recognizable to some of you. At the far end of the table here would be Associate Professor of History Ann Lifshitz. Next to her would be Professor of Anthropology Larry Kusner. And then next to him is Associate Professor of Political Science James Toole. We have what I hope will be an interesting conversation for you about fake news, but specifically how we see it sort of manifesting itself in Russia and in Western democracies. I'd like to start by actually offering a definition of fake news that we have seen from other panels we've actually had here. The definition would be anything that the author meant to be intentionally misleading or deceitful. Anything the author meant to be intentionally misleading or deceitful. That's actually a definition we got from Lisa Ryan, formerly of WBOI. It's an interesting definition. We think it's one that works, but do you think this definition works for fake news? Ann?
Well, I think it's missing one very important category, and that's what if somebody truly believes the things that they are saying, even though they have absolutely no connection to any known reality? And so I think that's a very important category here as well, because using this definition, right? I mean, if somebody's not intending for it to be misleading, does that mean it's not fake? And I think that's something that aside from issues of, you know, somebody who's mentally ill and delusional and says things that in those circumstances, what about people who are spreading things and claim that they truly believe them?
And that will come into play, obviously, when we start talking about propaganda more generally. Larry, do you like this definition of fake news?
I think it's a fine definition because it has embedded in it the notion that there's something that truly is not true. But to Ann's point, in anthropology, we study shamans around the world, religious practitioners, and we see them do things that are clearly sleights of hand, that they know are not real, and yet they convincingly pull it off because to some degree they do believe their own lies. It's a real true dilemma that we see, I think, in a lot of different social situations. So you don't have to be delusional. I'm not knocking shamans, but I think there's something to Ann's point.
Jamie?
Yeah, and I like the definition because of its focus on intent. And I do like what Ann has added. People who are deceiving, well, they're not, I guess you can't be deceiving if you're not intending to deceive, but people who say false things, believing those false things, no matter how much claiming to believe, fair enough. But what I like about it is the intent. So when we talk about fake news is produced when someone intends to deceive. Deceive is, of course, a stronger word than mislead. I would argue. So I think it really becomes clear, the definition of fake news, when we talk about the intent to deceive, which is clearly different from bias, and we can talk about that perhaps coming up.
Well, actually, let's go to bias right away then, Jamie, since you brought it up.
Yeah.
Clearly fake, there's this intention of deceit, but you see some difference here when talking about bias.
This is why I think it's important to focus on intent when it comes to fake news, with the caveat that Ann pointed out earlier. And that is that there's nothing wrong with having an opinion or having a point of view. It is impossible for all of news to be objective, right? So, there's some outstanding news outlets that also have a point of view that is expressed on their editorial pages, or indeed in the selection of what they choose to cover, and indeed in how they choose to describe what happened. So I don't think there's anything wrong with having a point of view, having an opinion, even if it's an opinion that's, somewhat out of the mainstream. I think that only adds to our democracy as long as we are aware of how to handle that and sort of educated and informed enough to be able to interpret that. So I don't think those things are wrong, and I think they certainly should not be labeled under the category fake news. It's fake news if you intend to deceive.
Larry?
Yeah, the issue of intent is critical here. First of all, intelligence analysts agonize over intent and how can we judge intent, because obviously for national security purposes, if someone is intending to do something, you need to guard against it. If not, there's not a threat. Threat's part of the, intent is part of the threat formula, they say. But ascertaining when that threat is present or not is extremely difficult because we cannot simply crawl inside people's heads. This also surfaced in debates in the electoral cycle that were had in the media over whether or not certain candidates were lying or not. And journalists have resisted saying lying because how do you know a person's intent? And I do have something I want to say later about Putin's intent, but there might be a more appropriate time for me to introduce that.
All right, Anne?
I think one of the things that I want to, I mean, I think I obviously totally agree that the intent issues is a very important one, but I think there's a very important caveat that we have to keep in mind, and that's it's fine to have a bias, but it's appropriate for that bias to be stated, right? So I think that there are certain news outlets that are very explicit about their bias, and as a result, it makes it that much easier for people to either go there because that's what they want to hear, or at least keep that in mind as they're processing the news. The potential danger is when information is presented as simple, straightforward fact, but the bias is built in there as well, and people can sometimes be caught off guard. And I want to be careful because, of course, all of us believe in the importance of critical thinking, but we have to be realistic. You cannot question every single word that comes at you. You're just not going to be able to get through the day. And so if you're assuming, for example, one great example, I think, in the American context is the local news, right? There's this assumption that local news is unbiased compared to, for example, MSNBC, Fox, and so on, that have a clearly stated bias. And one of the interesting things that we've seen in recent years is the increasing introduction of bias into local news without explicitly stating so. The most famous example is the Sinclair Broadcast Group that has been buying local stations, and as a result has been purposefully introducing editorial content in places that people are not accustomed to receiving editorial content. And so this is something that is also affecting the information that's transmitted to people. And I mention this example in part because our focus is, of course, going to be on Russia and the way Russia has intervened. But I think it's important to note that Russia is not the only source of introduction of bias and potential problematic content without a proper disclaimer into the consumption of information that we have.
We should mention that the idea that local news would have an editorial section is not a new thing. It's actually something that was very common for a long time, and now it's sort of being reintroduced. It used to be when you watch local news and the news editor would come on, make a comment, or the general manager of the station would do that. So we're sort of returning to an old way.
But without stating that we're doing so. And it's not a specially designated person who's there to introduce it. It's incorporated into the segments that previously, in between the kittens and fires.
Larry, you brought up shaman. I'm going to generalize that as the manipulation of public sentiment. There are ways that we can do this. Obviously, biased news might be one of the ways. What are some of the other ways that we see governments intentionally trying to bias public sentiment?
Well, bias comes in different forms. One is, as they say, spin, right? So you take a fact upon which everyone can agree, but you just cast it in a different way. You frame it differently. Maybe you use different language, either positive or negative language in relation to it. But there's another important source of bias, which is selection bias. What do people select to discuss? So you got fires, kittens, and then what they chose to speak about that might have some public interest or political angle. And you can be perfectly factual in what you're saying, but if you're ignoring the other half of the story or something else that's important, that also is a form of bias.
Right, there really is the issue of how long is 30 minutes. For example, going back to the evening news, 30 minutes is not really a 30-minute broadcast. Yeah, Anne?
I think that we want to think about the way that certain political systems are better equipped to be able to intervene in things like the news, because the United States doesn't technically have an official state news network. As a result, the way that we don't necessarily see the government paying to have a channel that transmits a certain amount of information. So there is kind of this interesting merger between the free market and the where you have people producing news that they assume people will want to hear, and thereby introducing bias, in that particular way. But of course, there are, the U.S. government also buys commercials and ads, right, that run on the that we're exposed to as well. So there are opportunities for the government to to transmit its message, but not in a way that a more authoritarian regime. They have that advantage of being able to have more opportunities to do so.
Jamie, you want to add any other ways in which manipulation of public sentiment is done?
Well, what I would say is that all governments manipulate public sentiment, and that at the mild end, there's nothing at all wrong with that. In fact, it would be arguably wrong for governments not to do that at the mild end. What I mean by that is that when we elect governments in democratic systems, we elect governments to do what the program that they have advertised as the things that they want to accomplish in government. And so we wouldn't expect a U.S. government run by Democrats to engage in, conservative social and economic policy. We expect that they will engage in more liberal policy, and indeed that they have the moral right to do that, having been elected by the population. So to a conservative government, having been elected by the population. So of course they're going to emphasize certain things that promote their causes and promote their policies, and they're going to make assertive arguments in favor of their policies and against the policies of the other side. But again, all of that is subject to sort of democratic control, rule of law, constitutionalism. And so we not only accept that, but we sort of embrace that as what needs to happen for any one government to move its policies forward. The problem, of course, is when there is no effective opposition, or when the media or press freedoms start to decline, or I shouldn't just say no effective opposition. It gets worse as the opposition, as we see oppositions become weaker. And of course, in a number of countries, there's no effective opposition whatsoever, and in those cases, manipulation of public opinion and ideas is, of course, morally wrong.
Mm-hmm. And there's a mythology that the Soviet Union and Russia were masters of propaganda. Is there a lot of evidence that says this is true, or is it just mythology?
The short answer, which of course I'm not going to stop at, is yes and no. I think it's important to differentiate between domestic propaganda and propaganda made for foreign consumption. So if you're looking at the Soviet Union and their domestic propaganda, on the one hand, this is a regime that from the very beginning devoted a tremendous amount of resources and energy into promoting a particular worldview and into reshaping the minds and belief systems of the people in that country. It had some of the greatest artists that they didn't kill, were contributing their talents to make this propaganda not just ideologically sound, but also artistically interesting. At the same time, it's important to note that the Soviet regime had a huge advantage, namely it was dealing with a closed system. So it never really had to worry about competition of ideas too much, and as a result, the domestic propaganda didn't have to be particularly sophisticated, right? It's not an accident that the Soviet Union starts to collapse precisely at a time when it is unable to maintain complete monopoly on information that its citizens are being exposed to. Now, in the propaganda that's developed for foreign consumption, that's a little bit more difficult because that's where that was more difficult for the Soviet regime because it had to be more sophisticated and it had to compete with alternative sources of information. And so that's where you see the Soviet Union develop some very interesting strategies. So for example, Soviet propaganda never made stuff up outright. There's always a tiny, it can be a really tiny bit. Sometimes the bit of truth can be bigger and smaller depending on the circumstance, but there's always something factual there. And then there's kind of spin, to go around it. One strategy that the Soviet Union did was they would, for example, buy an ad in the New York Times saying something positive about the Soviet Union, and then they would cite it in the propaganda, right? Making it appear as if the New York Times on whatever page is saying positive things about the Soviet Union. Sort of true, right? There's something positive about the Soviet Union on that page, and unless you actually go and check your, the footnote, you will never know that that was a paid, that was a paid advertisement. So in a sense, the regime is kind of using, okay, while Americans like footnotes, right? Americans like proof, the West likes proof. So they're using that particular, strategy. They're also taking advantage of the free press in the West, right? A lot of the things that they are able to criticize the United States for during the Cold War, for example, American racism of the American, of America. That's not a top secret that they had to ferret out using, very sophisticated propaganda. You could read it on the pages of other Western, media. But what we see happen, though, there is a very important shift that we see take place after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we'll talk about obviously about this in more detail. And Larry will talk about it from a military point of view. But the importance of the shift is if during the existence of the Soviet Union, the Soviet regime was very concerned about how it was perceived in the world. They wanted to be seen as a beacon of all that is progressive and all that is good, defined in a very specific, defined in a very narrow way. And it was fighting to change minds. It wanted to convince people, and it wanted to promote a particular ideology. What we see now is that we don't see a coherent ideology being promoted. And the regime is not even that concerned when it gets caught on outright lies. The goals have changed. The goals have changed from trying to convince people and trying to shape public opinion and an ideology to simply cede discord, right? There's almost this concession after the collapse of the Soviet Union that they're not going to be able to persuade people that Russia is going to be better. The only thing they can do is undermine. They can undermine Western institutions, and they can undermine people's faith in Western institutions, perhaps even more importantly, right? So the goal is chaos achieved at whatever, by whatever strategy can work. And that's a very important shift.
And I think this is a good time to move to Larry. Larry, you've been reading the official statements from President Putin as well as official documents out of military in terms of doctrines that they're proposing. What are you seeing there in terms of the ways they're going about either manipulating public sentiment, biasing things, or outright fake news?
Well, I found Anne's comments particularly interesting because in light of what you just said, I'm wondering if there weren't valuable lessons learned in their previous Soviet-era competition on the world stage that are being done not only still on the global world stage, but also domestically. So let me address those separately. And let me back up a little bit in terms of Russian doctrine. There is a publication I'd like to recommend for anyone in the listening audience or here to look up on your own. If you just Google "Thinking Like a Russian Officer," a document will come up that was published by the U.S. Training and Doctrinal Command in Fort Leavenworth, where they did a detailed study of Russian open public doctrine about how they're going to operate militarily. And Russia came to the conclusion, I think rightfully, that they could never take the U.S., their main competitor, in any standard force-on-force confrontation. So they had to find other ways of combating. And they've turned to information as their main weapon. They're literally weaponizing information. So one of the ways that we see this on the global stage is they've got one news outlet, Sputnik, which comes in different languages. And then the other main one really is RT, Russia Today, which is a Kremlin-run and funded operation. This is the organization where General Flynn got in so much trouble for going and sitting next to Putin and everything. And I happen to know that there were some generals who really dressed him down for that, because even in retirement, they don't do that. And what they do is they do mix very factual stuff. I have to say that before I started my research on Putin, which has been ongoing through a series of Department of Defense funded projects for like 3 or 4 years now, I used to go to RT-TV because sometimes I'd be looking for a world leader's speech that I wanted, and it's the only place I could find it. And it would be there verbatim. But then you get these incredibly biased spins on, for instance, events in Syria, or things that are just out and out false. When you try to check up on them, they lie. And so it's a real mix there that we're seeing globally. So those are some of the things that they're doing internationally. Domestically, though, one of the things that really impresses me about Putin is he is a real cool actor. He's incredibly capable. He does like town hall meetings on TV in Russia. They last 3 or 4 hours. He's peppered with questions from across Russia. Clearly, the moderators are feeding him the questions that are going to be the softballs, but some are not softballs. And he, on his feet, can think through them, and he really impresses his audience, I think. So I'm wondering if some of those lessons are learned, that you've got to mix your truth and fiction, and quite frankly, you've got to be good at it. And he's good at it. It's so clear in so many ways to me that his KGB training has really paid off for him. He's formidable. Mm-hmm.
Well, the length of the press conferences is something we hear about often, and they'll talk about the 3 or 4 hour press conference and how he is able, so appears to be effortlessly. And what do you think of these press conferences?
I think that, we can give Mr. Putin points for stamina, which, as we learned last year, is a very important criteria in a political leader. But I think it's also kind of really important to note the context in which, these press conferences, these town hall meetings, they're performances. They're carefully choreographed performances, and this is a tradition. I mean, even to a certain extent. I mean, not the media coverage part of it, of course, but the structure of it even predates the Soviet Union. This idea that the only person who can solve all the problems in the context of Russia, the Soviet Union, and Russia again, is the Tsar, the Soviet leader, and now Putin. And so you will have a mix-in of difficult questions in there as well, right? To show, again, precisely to show the people, you see, if you have a problem and a grievance, your local officials can't address it for you. There is one person who will look out for you. There is one person who will fix it. And there's a lot of information online debunking some of these fixes where it's proclaimed. And from now on, you will have running water. And then, it lasts long enough for somebody to take a picture of the running water, and then the running water disappears again. So I mean, they serve a very, very important purpose, and there are a lot of people in Russia don't view them as performances. They view them as very genuine. There are also, of course, people, a very small, I would argue, a smaller percentage of the population in Russia that definitely sees it all as made up. But again, they're a tiny voice that ultimately does not have any political capital, but make really fun memes, in social media.
I'm going to come back to social media in a moment because obviously it's a vehicle that's used. Before I do that, though, Jamie, the idea that things are just outright false. We've heard from both of them. It's just wrong. These are lies. Is this accepted by the international community? What's the reaction?
Mm-hmm. Well, when we're talking about fake news generated by Russia in particular, right? Yeah. That's what your question is mainly about. So it's a complicated situation. So a lot of people, sure, are distrustful of Russian news these days. People around the world, but we also have to remember that there are a lot of people who, over a number of decades, have developed a pretty deep distrust toward the United States and toward the West in general, as a result of decolonization and the many mishaps there, and of course the colonial era before that. Decolonization in the 40s, 50s, 60s created a lot of ill will in many parts of the world toward European powers, and of course, U.S. power during the Cold War, and some of the things that we did during the Cold War have, of course, increased anti-Americanism as well. So, regardless of whether regardless of whether we think that anti-Americanism is justified or not justified, or anti-Western sentiment justified or unjustified, what this has done is created a general climate of cynicism in which that makes it easier for Russian fake news to get its message across, because Russia can just say, look, the West has been lying to you for decades, and many people may disagree with that, but there are going to be a lot of people who, for some very good reasons, distrust the Western media and Western governments. So I think it ends up being a lot more complicated than we might think it is in the U.S. when we look at some of this Russian, Russian statements and media things, and we just say, oh, this is ridiculous. How can anyone believe this? Well, we need to remember the historical context.
Now, when it comes to the actual world leaders, though, when they're hearing these things that they should know better than us are false, what's their reaction? And I know what mine is and yours is.
Well, sure. Behind closed doors, I'm sure the vast majority of world leaders, know a fair amount about what's true and what isn't. But there are always going to be some world leaders who don't know as much. And what really matters is if their publics are accepting this stuff, it's not in the interests of a leader to go out on a limb and criticize one of the strongest countries in the world, Russia, when perhaps his or her population is, of mixed mind about it.
Mm-hmm. Larry, when you talk about delivery mechanisms, social media obviously is another way. We have Putin with his 3-hour-long press conferences, but how is social media being used more directly, more specifically?
Instead of me telling you, can I have some Russian military experts tell you?
Sure.
All right.
Didn't know we had them here.
No, but I have the
okay,
quotes written down
good,
here.
Good.
Yeah. So here's some of the things that they have been advocating, and there's one individual in particular. He's not the only one, but he's become rather infamous. Valery Gerasimov, in 2013, in a Russian military publication, published a pretty important article laying out how the new type warfare or hybrid warfare would be conducted, and an integral part of that is the use of information. And so this particular quote comes from two other military experts in Russia, Chekhanov and Bogdanov, and it is information warfare. In the new conditions will be starting point of every action now called the new type of warfare, a hybrid war, in which broad use will be made of the mass media and, where feasible, the global computer networks, blogs, various social networks, etc. Another quote, also from another publication by Chekhanov and Bogdanov, Strategic information confrontation. So we're seeing information as the force-on-force thing here. Strategic information confrontation can disorganize military and state command and control measures. I love this one. Dupe the adversary, create public opinion, organize anti-government demonstrations. And I've got a number of other quotes there, but I think that's probably enough to see what their intent is in terms of how to use these things. And then they've made very good use, as we saw, of trolls from around the world. Teenagers in Macedonia who want to make a few bucks by creating some fake news stories that are totally false and then seeding them in that crazy internet world out there. Which that relates to another thing that, if I can have a moment, I like to talk about with regard to Russian doctrine. Going back to Gerasimov and Putin as well, I'm going to quote both of them. The bottom line of Gerasimov's famous article, as well as other things that he's written, is an acceptance that the world is chaotic. And I don't mean that in the simple adjective sense, but in the mathematical sense. You know, mathematicians have a branch of mathematics, chaos theory. And it's based on the fact that many things in life are made up of small parts that interact in nonlinear ways. And it makes it very difficult to control them, to the point where it's folly to control them. It's more like riding a wave when you're surfing. Now, you can ride it successfully and get what you want, but you're not controlling the wave. And this has been embraced by the Russians. So Gerasimov talks about this extensively. I'll just quote Putin here because you can see it from the leader's mouth himself. In 2006, he said, and I quote, "We should not chase after quantitative indicators. Our responses will have to be based on intellectual superiority. They will be asymmetrical and less costly." So you see where they're going. And so one of the things that our government absolutely fears is losing control of the message and information. And it's caused a number of failures in messaging. Most notably, our early attempts at messaging against ISIS were ridiculed because they want to control everything. There's an old joke in the Army Corps of Engineers who are responsible for flood control. They're there to straighten the rivers like God intended. You know, it's that linear control thing. The Russians gave up on that. They're like, no, we're riding a wave. And so they are comfortable going to a bunch of kids in Macedonia or wherever and saying, hey, we'll give you a few bucks if you make up a good story. And then letting the kids do it for them. That's riding a wave. That kind of operation, decision-making, scares the daylights out of our decision-makers, and it's put us at a disadvantage.
And what's interesting here is you think about the era that Ann was talking about, where artists, I mean, people who produced beautiful things were the ones, and somewhat costly compared to, here are a couple of bucks, create a rumor on the internet. Ann?
And it's important to note, I mean, one of the interesting things about this, of course, is this is Russia operating from a position of weakness, right? The realization that they don't have the resources, that they don't have the money to be able to win things outright, whether militarily, whether in terms of message. And so this is typical. I mean, this is a typical situation where a weaker group finds a way to capitalize on a cheaper strategy, and has found it to be, very effective. Because I think we can certainly safely say that kind of the message has been lost, or at least it's, we're very much in the process of catching up to this idea rather than having any handle on it.
Larry, coming back to you, how dangerous is this? Fake news in general, or these examples more specifically?
It seems to be extremely dangerous. We've seen the effects here, and I know it's debated in our society, but when the 16 intelligence agencies come to the conclusion that the Russians interfered in the election, this is one of the ways. They had it down to they knew when our current president liked to consume his news and made sure that the kind of news stories they wanted him consuming were there. This actually goes back to a Soviet-era psychological theory and operation called, just jumped out of my brain, reflexive control theory. Okay, and it's the idea, and here once again I'll quote some military leaders in Russia. It's installing program filters that force the client to perceive the world in a way desired by the programmers. And it's to feed information to people, to alter their worldview so that the people naturally will make the decisions that the Russians want them to make. And so we've seen it to some degree in our own country, but it's had a much greater impact in Western Europe. And the intention here is, and we can quote Russian sources on this, that they want to undermine Western democracy. I'd like to make reference to work of colleagues of mine at Texas A&M. They recently completed a study in which they compared the social media messaging of the Russian government versus the Chinese government. And they found a really striking difference. It's very interesting. Russia wants to disrupt the world order. They don't like it. China doesn't want to disrupt the world order. They're fine with treaties and the way things, they just want a bigger part in it. It's a fundamentally different intention, and for that reason, I think these Russian actions are particularly dangerous to the free world.
Yeah.
Another important aspect of this is, as Russia works to undermine, again, both our institutions and our faith in their institutions, what's significant about this is that essentially Russia is able to use Western ideas, right? Western technology, or technology that originated, in the West, right? So the internet may have been invented by the West, right? But we see Russia being able to use it in a much more in a very savvy way to undermine kind of the very place where internet came from, right? And the two aspects of it that are so important is, one is, of course, the ability to transmit and to create destructive messages over social media, right? This is something we see, or paying somebody to do that. But the other thing, and I think that at least in my opinion, that is one of the things that they succeeded in 2016, is to be able to have us do that, right? It wasn't just the fact that there was stuff coming over from Russia through Macedonia or just from Russia directly that was undermining what was happening in the United States. We see Americans, right, sometimes consciously, but sometimes unconsciously, parroting the messages that were coming from there, and as a result, contributing to the destruction of our system and of our culture and of our political system. Kind of with our own hands, and that's simultaneously the genius of the approach, right? Because it's very low cost, but it's also one of the huge dangers of it.
And to Anne's point, the Russians have developed bots, not even real people, to communicate with Americans. And the bots will reflect a person online in some social media, their concerns, and then engage with them. And this was heavily done in the so-called blue wall states during the election. This is a fact. This is something they did, and it may have had the desired effect.
Jamie?
Yeah, well, I think these are all really great and interesting points. And I think, when we talk about the effects, the dangerous effects of fake news, I mean, we see domestic effects and we see international effects. And I want to be sort of clear on what some of these are, and they're important. So domestic effects, we see Russia interfering in the ways described here in elections. And we see it happen not only here, but we see it in Western Europe as well. It's very, very well documented. We have all sorts of evidence showing it. In fact, the Russians are kind of happy. They don't mind that we know that they're doing it. That's part of the plan, in part because, as Larry said, the plan is to sow chaos. It's not to do one specific thing. It's to raise doubts about the fundamental legitimacy of Western democracy. And so there are many ways of doing that, and by causing general chaos, increasing doubts, increasing skepticism, that can be accomplished through many types, many different means. What I'd like to really emphasize here is the importance of general publics. Andy, earlier you asked about leaders, and I sort of answered that by saying, well, leaders generally know what's going on, and I think that's generally true. If you look to leaders or you look to experts, if you know a lot about this stuff, you can see through it very quickly. But not many people have the time to be doing this investigation on their own, right? Most people, we all have our lives to lead, and very few people are specializing in this kind of thing. And that's exactly what the Russians are counting on, that they can skew public opinion, and that ties the hands of leaders who often know better themselves, but have to deal with publics whose minds are now sort of poisoned by the kind of garbage that's emanating from Russia. So I think that's the real danger here, and this is Russia's method, and this is part of what makes this method of asymmetrical warfare work for Russia, because it's relatively cheap to just sow chaos. You don't have to sow a particular message. You don't have to convince people of any one thing. You just have to increase doubts. And what the doubts are, once again, are doubts over the very legitimacy of Western democracy as a system of government that can solve problems, and the norms associated with that. It's also a deliberate weakening, it's a deliberate attack on mainstream parties everywhere. And in a way, Russia, I think, doesn't care what kind of extremist parties rise up. It doesn't have to be someone who agrees with Vladimir Putin ideologically. The point is, if extremist parties of the right and the left gain more and more credibility, and the mainstream parties of the middle are suffering, and we see this in country after country after country throughout the West, Russia's achieved its goal. And it's done it by trying to poison public opinion, even when leaders and experts know better.
And to Jamie's point about they don't care who they use to sow discord, and Putin's speeches domestically, one of his favorite themes to, I guess, get the base around him is the Nazi threat. But at the same time, Russia is funding neo-Nazi groups in France, Germany, elsewhere, to sow that discord. It would seem to be an incredibly dangerous job or course of action for Russia to take, given the history. But then again, they're riding the wave, and they really don't care. They want to sow discord and then hope to reap the whirlwind afterward.
The second point that I was going to make was the fact that while they don't care right or left, they do seem to be tilting right, which is very, especially particularly in Europe. I think they're definitely going right, and I'm not sure. I don't think that they see it as dangerous because first of all, of course, they defeated fascism once; they'll defeat it again. Plus, it's not their problem. But ultimately, I think that they see themselves savvy enough ultimately to be able to stave off the onslaught. Plus, they have control over the message, so they can call anybody a Nazi, and so ultimately, domestically, the people who are referred to as Nazis have nothing to do, have nothing to do with that. But the other thing I just wanted to add to Jamie's point, in addition to undermining Western democracy, they're also trying to undermine all information, right? So in a sense, the more crap there is, right, the more people are bombarded with information, a significant proportion of it is not valid. It raises questions about everything else. So in a sense, they're helping contribute to this idea that one piece of information is just as good as, is equally bad, right? And so the sense of that there's not an actual truth, that there's no point in trying to find something that's actually accurate because everybody's lying. So it really doesn't matter. You just pick whatever you want out of that giant pile, and that is kind of a very important part of course, of undermining our institutions and taking advantage precisely of the free press, right? I mean, essentially using the free press to help undermine the principles of the free press and exchange of ideas.
Jamie, should there be a response from the international community, and what should it look like?
I think it's tough because we're talking about regulating speech here, right? And that always is really tough. In this country, we zealously guard speech. I mean, more than almost any other democracy in the world. That doesn't make us more democratic because other democracies do sort of zealously guard other aspects of democracy better than we do. But we have a long history of First Amendment protections, et cetera. So I think it's a tough thing to do, especially for Americans, because we're so used to the idea that if there's nasty or incorrect speech out there, we shouldn't regulate it. The solution is we fight back against it with facts and good argument, et cetera. But one wonders, in this kind of environment where information is so deeply poisoned, what can you do? I have no easy solution. I'm just pointing out the real difficulty of this. I'd also point out that at the international level, of course, when it comes to sort of regulating through international treaties, international organizations, international treaties and organizations are really quite weak and don't have much effect. So, really, I think the solutions have to be through things like better public education, better sort of public education on the issues. I'm not talking about K through 12, whatever, but in its most general sense, and sort of just fighting back against these lies. I don't think there's any one easy solution.
Anne.
And I think it's so interesting because, I mean, it's precisely because America, and I don't mean this necessarily critically, but we fetishize the idea of free speech to a point where it makes us nervous to say somebody's lying because that might be seen as a potential, attack on free speech. And it's kind of interesting that actually Europe seems to be kind of being more proactive, right? In the response to the fact that they have been exposed to this bombardment as well, and their elections have also been, have been interfered with. We see the EU, for example, setting up a full-time disinformation debunking operation. So, I mean, there's a website, there are articles, and they brag, and on their page, they actually brag about how many myths they have been able to debunk, right? So here is an effort. I mean, it's the EU, so it's a little bit different, obviously, than the one country's country's government doing it. But we are starting to see Western democracies trying to fight against this, because fundamentally, right, there's this interesting disconnect, right? We have been, and by we I mean Western democracies, right, have been concerned when we're thinking about cybersecurity, right? We've been concerned about making sure that the information is being transmitted without other people having access to it, right? What we see in this, I almost said Soviet Union, what we see in Russia, and actually places like China as well, right? They're much more interested about the content, right? And so in a sense, this is what's giving them an advantage. And so to a certain extent, we have to decide, are we willing to think about it the way that they are, and or is that too much for us? We're not necessarily willing to compromise our, unfailing love for free speech, and we're willing to see the destruction of all other institutions in order to be able to say that we were for free speech, nonstop.
Larry?
Yeah, I've actually been participating in a series of seminars that are organized by the Pentagon to look at whether or not it's possible to inoculate a population against things like fake news. And so they've invited scholars from around the world. It's been truly a global effort. Experts in marketing. There's psychologists that have studied fake news long before it was popular. And they're like so happy now because people actually care about them. And what I learned was just kind of daunting and disturbing to me. One thing is, Anne's absolutely right, the experts from Europe are far more likely to say we need to control the flow of information some pretty direct ways. I'll never forget a guy from Lithuania was pretty clear that was not going to be a problem for him, which since Russia's at his front door, I can understand. But the kind of depressing thing to me is there are ways that psychologists found to inoculate people, but they only have small effects. And all of these have been done in experiments, right? And there's that problem of ecological validity. You can have a valid result in a scientific experiment, but does it work in the wild? And I think that's a big question. And then the really kind of disturbing thing to me personally is the one effective thing you can do, undermine your opposing source, right? Don't attack the information, the content, which is what we teach at a university, but no, just undermine them, say bad things about them so people won't believe them. And, I think ideologically that's not where we want to go in higher ed, but it seems to be the most successful thing that you can do. So, I don't know, it's tough.
I just point out one other thing, which is that sometimes fake news backfires. And we see this in the Russian case, right? I mean, fake news from Russia was, did to some degree help to get Donald Trump elected. I mean, we don't have to get into that whole debate about whether, how much we want to blame Russia.
Panel. That's a different panel.
I know, it's a different panel. But the point is, to some degree, there's no doubt, and our intelligence agencies agree, et cetera, right? So that happened, but then what happened after that? The Russia investigations on Donald Trump have caused him to, restrain what he says about Russia, and in the end led to the sanctions bill passed by the U.S. Congress, signed very reluctantly by Donald Trump, that put even stronger sanctions on Russia. And so, from Vladimir Putin's point of view, he should chalk that up as at least a loss, and that's something that bill is not going to be easy to reverse in the short term because it specifically prevents Donald Trump from changing these sanctions by himself. So. This isn't a perfect record of undermining Western democracy, et cetera. It can be taken too far, and I think, to some degree, Vladimir Putin certainly is trying to figure out, what the right amount is.
I'm going to argue that that actually the Trump thing is a success, and the sanctions themselves. I mean, if we think there are a couple of different ways of evaluating sanctions, right? I mean, sanctions affected the access to certain goods and services and quality of life and standard of living for ordinary people in Russia. So if you care about that sort of thing, then yes, the continuation of sanctions is a terrible thing. If, on the other hand, the continuation of sanctions allows the state to continue to talk about the fact that everybody is against us, that we have to stand firm, that we have to support our leader, and that you ultimately don't actually care about people's standard of living, which I would argue is the case of Russia, because certainly Putin and his friends have access to all the goods and services that they can possibly need on the unsanctioned list. And so in that sense, the continuation of sanctions pretty much it simply gives more fodder to Putin's propaganda machine as far as we need to stand firm and we need to be united. So yeah, it would have been nice if it was gotten rid of, but if it was, then they would have had to invent something else, right? That they would have to talk about how the world is against us, which is why you can't have nice things.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, and it's a broader point than I was making, and it's well worth listening to, and I mean it's correct. But what I was thinking is in a somewhat narrower term. One thing we know about Vladimir Putin is that he is incensed. He was already incensed at the sanctions. So personally, he hates the sanctions. So for him personally, this is a big defeat. This is a big backfire in terms of his personal interests, in terms of his reasoning. Another thing we know about Vladimir Putin is a pretty widely accepted view, is that he's a master tactician in the short term, but he doesn't really have good strategic thinking in the long term. And so again, if he's thinking short term and considers himself a master of the short term manipulation of facts and media, et cetera, however, but at the same time, his actions led to a result that surely infuriates him even more, then there certainly is some real cost to him personally. And so Anne's right on the broader level, I think, but we have to remember that from Putin's point of view, not everything has gone well.
That's very true. But once again, I go back to Russian military doctrine, which is well established, goes back at least 12 years ago, where they were openly publishing this in manuscripts in their military journals and everything, and all that's been compiled, and we now understand it. This was the plan. This was the long game. And so while he may exhibit some momentary frustrations, I think he's probably prepared to have these setbacks, because once again, he's not trying to straighten a river. He's riding a wave, and he's had a long career of doing this, and he was trained by one of the best, not the best, intelligence agencies in the world. So I'm a little more cautious about, or concerned about, his long game.
And of course, our loss in credibility, right? I mean, the damage that has been done to American standing and American credibility, American influence in Europe, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, in different ways, the international institutions, all of that. I mean, what are sanctions compared to that? I mean, that's the kind of prize you can't expect to get so quickly.
No, and I agree with both of you. But there's a long-term element, there's a short-term element, there's a personal element, there's a state element.
But I agree with you about the personal,
it's a complicated picture. It's not all victory.
And actually, from the long-term perspective, you know, going ahead and sowing discord among predominantly right groups or neo-Nazi groups, that could obviously come back in a very negative way. Yeah. But that's long-term. That's right. And I find it amusing when we're saying 12 years sitting next to a historian and talking about things that are well established and long ago.
You know, I thought about that very point because I do think it's a dangerous game. I mentioned that earlier. But if you look at how World War II turned out for the Soviets, it turned out pretty well. And to Anne's point, did Stalin really care that much that 20 million Russians died?
No.
Because he killed 20 million of his own, on his own. And so if Putin is of the, I don't want to put him quite in the same class as a Stalin, but if he has that kind of realpolitik perspective, then I would agree with Anne that he probably doesn't care a whole lot.
But that personal dimension, I think, is important. I think it would have been pleasant for Putin to be able to kind of say, I've reached a personal, this personal arrangement, because I think that's something that the two have in common, that they believe in the power of personal relationships.
And also, it's important to remember that the U.S. and Russia do have a lot of shared interests in certain parts of the globe, and this is severely hampering U.S.-Russia cooperation. Not everywhere. We still cooperate well in Syria in the short term, and particular bombing runs, whatever. But the point is that that there are other immediate costs to the Soviet Union. I mean, to Russia. I did the same thing, made the same mistake to Russia. So this is making Russia the backfiring, the new sanctions bill, the fact that Donald Trump cannot now just come out praising Russia as he did earlier on, and that any cooperation with Russia is seen as deeply suspect because of all this. There are definite short-term costs to the Soviet Union, to Russia. So I'm not disagreeing with you guys. I want to make that perfectly clear. What I'm saying is it's a multi-layered thing. There are costs, there are costs, there are benefits, and the point is, we were talking about all the dangers and downsides to fake news. I readily agree there are many more downsides. But I just want to point out the complexity.
And that's been a tragedy because there have been some ways that the U.S. and Russian militaries cooperated very well, and the military professionals on both sides were very happy. Counterterrorism, things of that nature, and that is now seriously jeopardized.
That's right.
Now, other than Jamie turning this into a fake news panel by referring to the wrong countries, deliberately referring to the wrong countries involved, I always like, when we're talking about fake news, I do want to come back and make sure that we very quickly suggest a few ways that people can be better consumers of news and information. And so, just very quickly, what's one, if you could offer one suggestion, what's one suggestion that you'd give to people? Jamie, we'll go ahead and start with you.
One suggestion of a source, or
just a way to confront, the fake news or biased news.
I'll talk about a more general method. The best way to confront biased news is to read widely and consume news widely. Now, of course, we don't all have that much time to do that, right? But the point is, don't get locked into the narrow sort of stream of news that's coming from your Facebook feed, which is very likely to reinforce a lot of the opinions you already have because your friends and relatives, or at least most of your relatives, who knows, may agree with you on things, right? We all have those relatives who disagree with us, right? So the point is, if you're a liberal, read some conservative news. If you're a conservative, read some liberal news. That's, I would say, the single best strategy that we can follow as American citizens to become better informed and be able to sort of identify flaws, and identify fake news, but also identify exaggerations and other forms of misleading content.
I'd like to reinforce what Jamie just said. What I personally do is I don't have to go to these sources, NBC, then I'll go to CNN, and then I hit Fox News. And I do that routinely for anything that matters to me. And it's not that you can mix them up and the happy medium is the truth. That's not the point. It's about checking them against one another. And the other thing I would put out is always be on guard against your own personal confirmation bias. We naturally go to sources that are going to reinforce our worldview. Even when we see all of the information, we tend to see, well researched by psychologists, we tend to see just the pieces, even when they're in front of our face, that we want to agree with. So just be on guard. That is the whole purpose of critical thinking and the disciplined thinking that in higher ed we've been trying to get at for 2,400 years. And that's a fact. It's what started Aristotle and Plato, and keep up the tradition.
Anne?
Well, since reading and critical thinking has been taken, I'm going to add one. I'm going to go in a slightly different direction, and I'm going to say that since one of the goals of fake news is to destroy our institutions, I think one of the things that we have to think about is, in addition to reading, because I mean, reading and critical thinking is ultimately about ourselves, right, and our ability to process information around us. But I think it is also really important to think about our institutions and think about how we can strengthen them and how can we protect them against the kind of the onslaught of information that is undermining or even actively trying to destroy them. And it can't just be the government, and it can't just be individuals. It needs to be ordinary citizens and civic groups, but also, with a certain amount of political leadership as well, in an effort to protect those things that are that we consider valuable and important. Because, as I think we have seen, institutions do not exist unchanged by the political environment, and they can in fact be undermined and destroyed, especially in the United States, where they're primarily based on customary practices rather than law.
And I will actually throw in there, check out some international sources. I know it throws people off when I say that, and I think Jamie and Anne leave that intentionally so that I have to say, check out some international sources.
Hey,
but
if I talk about civic institutions, you can talk about international sources.
Sounds like a good trade. Now we've reached the point where it's question and answer from the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand. I'll walk over with the microphone, and they will be very happy. We'll start in the back with Nancy.
I'm Nancy Hansen, and I am the convener of the Fort Wayne Area League of Women Voters. And in November, I'm doing a show on WELT about how to get information. Because we have a lot of people who say to us when we're out in the public, I don't know where to get information, which in this day and age kind of surprises me, being a news junkie. But I'm really interested in where you three, what news sources are your go-to news sources?
We'll start with Anne.
I'll be honest, I don't have one. I actually use Twitter, and I invested a fair amount of time in creating kind of my timeline, right? So that it consists of American news sources, European news sources, Russian news sources, Ukrainian. I mean, essentially any Belarusian. Basically, the languages I can read. And so as a result, I've made my timeline a place that I can go to get a relatively diverse set of information. So I have both individuals, I have journalists, I have and I have newspapers and journals.
Larry?
Yeah, I mentioned where I get most of my news and how I kind of run that circuit, but I also use search engines. You know, a topic comes up, I hear about something on the radio, and then I just, you know, Google it or whatever, and go to whatever sources, and that's where I pick up BBC and other foreign news sources. But there's one site I do want to plug here. It's a fascinating one if you're interested in conflicts and violence around the globe. It's called Live UA Map, LIVEUAMAP. It was started by a couple of Ukrainians during the Maidan crisis, and they wanted to let the world know what was going on, so they started live streaming tweets and geolocating them. They now do it around the world. And literally, you can watch conflicts unfold in real time. They have some control on what they post, or sometimes they post things, they'll say it's dubious. I don't know how they do that. So there's some vetting. But obviously, there's a danger that some things are going to filter through that might not be true. But it's amazed and perhaps heartening at the amount of truth-telling that does exist in the world. And it really is apparent when you see it come up on these maps. So Live UA Map, it's a wonderful source, I think.
Jamie?
Well, I study mainly international politics, so so my news sources are skewed a little bit that way. But I get most of the first places I always go are the New York Times and the Financial Times. Of course, both of them are subscription-based, so you have to be able to be willing to pay for that. But the New York Times, because it's the best sort of traditional U.S. newspaper that in its coverage of international affairs, and the Financial Times, which is a British newspaper, which I think has by far the best global coverage of any traditional newspaper. Beyond that, what I like to do a lot also is read journals of opinion. And these are small magazines, some of you know, on the right and on the left. Famous ones on the left are The Nation, which has been published continuously since 1865, and The New Republic. On the right, the National Review and the Weekly Standard. And what I like about these is they're unabashed in their political opinions. And they clearly state, you know, they're conservative or they're liberal. And I read on both sides. I tend to read The Nation and the National Review most often. The National Review is interesting these days because it supports Trump, whereas the Weekly Standard has been sort of against Trump on the right. Both of those are really interesting for those kind of reasons.
Next question. Hey, I'm Brian, and I just have a question. So, like, way back in the day when everyone was playing with like swords and bow and arrows, and then someone made guns, everyone was like, we should go and get some guns because that's like the newest form of weaponry. And like you said, that information was the newest form of weaponry. So like, what would be stopping like the United States from like partaking in the same? I mean, it might be a little like unethical, but like, what would stop them from partaking in like this similar sort of like information weaponry like the like Russia does?
Our institutions and the norms that guide those. And as long as those institutions are strong and we are supportive of those norms that have traditionally been American values, we ought to be okay. If those institutions are weakened, and this is precisely what the Russians would like to do, then it's like game up, and then we become like them, even more so. And I'm not saying that our government has never lied, but as governments go, we're probably certainly one of the more truthful ones.
Anne's laughing too hard, so I have to go to Jamie first, then Anne.
All right. What I would say is it's a great question. It reminds us that this is, you know, political scientists have looked, you know, we've looked at this for decades, and we look at asymmetrical warfare, and Larry brought that up earlier, and Anne was talking about it as well. So yeah, the information warfare is, you know, a weapon of the weak, or at least it's a weapon that can be used very cost effectively against stronger powers by powers that in relative terms are weaker. So this is a fundamental danger just from a national security perspective, a fundamental danger to the U.S. because our sort of global predominance militarily is severely threatened by not only this information stuff, but also by cyber threats of other, you know, technologically driven rather than content driven cyber threats. And countries that aren't as strong as the United States are able to use these kinds of measures to really weaken the sort of the gap that we have, the advantage that we traditionally have enjoyed militarily. So from a national security perspective, this is a deep, deep threat. Both the kinds of stuff we've talked about in terms of the content of fake news and the technology that is behind cyber warfare that, for example, could be used against the U.S. power grid or other types of targets.
The United States used to use information warfare, right? There was something called Voice of America, there was something called Radio Free Europe, and these were US government-funded radio stations that transmitted information, all true, obviously, about Western ways of life and America and problems with the Soviet Union into the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe. And the Soviet Union had to try to dampen it. And it was kind of a very fascinating thing. From the Russian point of view, they are essentially, what they're doing now is payback, right? They're basically, they believe that they were undermined by information coming from the West. Since they don't believe this idea that there was an effort, since they didn't see it as a purely ideological thing, right? They saw it as a way to destroy the Soviet way of life. So their effort to destroy, I would say, maybe it's the strongest way I can say it, but I think it's true. Destroyed our way of life, right? To them, that's payback, and they're doing it since they're no longer interested in promoting ideology. They just want chaos and destruction, right? And so we are not ready necessarily to do that. Maybe again, whether we should or not, that's a different issue. But of course, the other problem is what information would we send, right? How would we ever? This is the problem with democracies. How the hell would we ever agree, right? What disinformation to even, right. To even send? And I say that half jokingly, right? The problem of democracy is the multiplicity of voices, right? And the negotiation.
As well as an advantage.
It's our strength and our weakness at the same time.
Anne often says, if you want efficient government, go with something authoritarian or totalitarian.
Long-term prospects are tough, but in the short run.
Our press is worldwide been kind of seen as an example of what a free world, what a free press is supposed to be. It used to be said that the news agencies, their job is to tell us, not to tell us what to think, but to tell us what to think about. Now with Russia constantly trying to undermine our way of life, in their eagerness in order to get a scoop, they have become willing idiots as in helping Russia with this dissemination of false news. Outside of the occasional, oh my bad, is there anything that we can do as a society to hold these news agencies that are supposed to be legitimate, verifying their sources, accountable for what they report?
Let's go with Jamie.
Well, I would say one thing. One I think positive thing that's coming out of the U.S. media is that I think reporters, editors, et cetera, in the U.S. media are now a lot more willing to call out a lie. And it's been endlessly frustrating to a lot of us who have been news consumers for many years, right? To see how tentative and sort of worried the U.S. media has been over many years to call anything a lie, right? You never say any lies. You just say that someone got something wrong. And finally now, I think this has come to a point where you are seeing, media, throughout the U.S. saying, a politician said this and it's simply wrong, and here's the evidence. And I think that's an important thing that the media can do and is doing in a way that it never has done before. Now that's probably just one small piece of the puzzle when we're talking about sort of questioning what's coming out of, say, the Russian media or coming out of the internet from some kid in Macedonia. But I think it's a welcome change.
Larry?
My son just graduated with a journalism degree. I'd like to use my lifeline. It's a great question. They're not just chasing after news stories and becoming willing idiots. They are doing that to a degree, but they're doing it to get clicks or buy subscriptions. And so as we as consumers of news consume that news and find certain sources to not be that good, just don't go to the website, and that's what's going to hurt them. And how we do that collectively and organize that as a society is another question, but I appreciate the question.
I mean, I totally agree. I think being a better consumer is probably is the most important thing we can do on an individual basis, because one of the problems is that everybody wants to be the first, right? They get it out there. They don't have time to verify or check. It gets forwarded, right, 1,000 times. what am I saying? Thousands is nothing, right? They get forwarded, you know, many times. By the time there's a retraction, nobody ever goes back, right, and forwards the retraction at least half as many times as the original, right? And so that's, I mean, in a sense, again, this is one of the things that the strategy capitalizes in. And so as a result, this is, to a certain extent, we have to be, as long as we have a free society, right, we have to make sure that we take advantage of that to be better consumers.
Yeah, and the problem with retractions is there's people have researched this. What are the effects of retractions? And unfortunately, the main effect is you wind up telling the falsehood again, and then more people believe it. There's a blowback effect. So this is truly a wicked problem, as they say.
And one last question.
In case anybody watches Vox, V-O-X, not Fox News, they did an interesting piece a few months ago looking at late-night satire as a counteraction against the way that you know, the news media has to report something. But late-night satire will acknowledge, here's the headline for the day, quickly dismiss it and show it for the falsehoods that there are, and then move on into like these in-depth, still comical, but in-depth journalistic pieces trying to expose what's actually going on within our own institutions. And you know, within like 6 minutes, this clip explains how this happens and says, actually, late night TV is beating news channels at the game to expose people to more stuff. Even though, you know, Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert have always said, please don't get your news from me, people are going that direction because they can see how quickly you can dismiss the lies and then dive deeper into things and still do it with a good deal of sarcasm, but to do it in a way that gives people that information that starts to make them think.
I'd like to comment on that in an anthropological way, of course. That was the role of the court fool in the Middle Ages, and a wise king kept a court fool. In ancient Celtic societies, it was the satirists, and supposedly Celtic warriors would commit suicide if they were too badly satirized and embarrassed in public. And I've been very impressed myself at the role that we're seeing satirists play in our society today. And the other thing I'd like to mention, this is in many ways what started Aristotle and Plato down the road that they took and why we are here today. They were horrified at how essentially fake news and bogus arguments were used to kill their mentor, Socrates. And so in so many ways, our job is just not ended.
Anne?
I think we should end
That's a good one. We'll just end right there.
We'll end with philosophy.
All right. Well, I would like to thank our panelists, Associate Professor of History, Ann Lifshiz, Professor of Anthropology, Larry Kusner, and then Associate Professor of Political Science, Jamie Toole. Thank you very much. Our sponsors were the Honor Center for letting us take over their space, of course, College Television for broadcasting it, WBOI as well, the American Democracy Project, and the Departments of Anthropology, History, and Political Science. Please give the panel a round of applause.